Listeners, this is going to be a great show. Ayo Magwood M.Sc, founder of Uprooting Inequity LLC, specializes in evidence-based, apolitical, and solutionary training on understanding and remediating structural racism. She is passionate about fostering cross-difference cooperation towards realizing equal opportunity for all. Her superpower is her ability to synthesize a wide range of research data, primary sources, and abstract concepts, and weave them into engaging narratives and diagrams. Ayo was recently recognized as a leading expert on social justice education. She has a BA from Brown University and a master's in science and applied economics from Cornell University. Now, I have used a lot of what Ayo has taught me in my own practice, and I have to say it is brilliant. I cannot wait for you to hear from her. Here we go. I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Ayo, welcome to the Time for Teachership podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited.
Yes. And so I cannot wait for our conversation. We're just going to kind of dive in here. We were just talking before we hit record. Normally, the first question I ask is, what do we want people to keep in mind as we jump into our conversation? And you were telling me about an election unit you taught that was not actually about candidates, but about kind of what people needed to know to understand what was going on. And I just thought that was brilliant. Do you mind starting there and just talking to us about that unit?
Sure. So it started because I had a student debate on affirmative action. And of course, I understand that people have different positions on it, ideological positions. So I was prepared for that. But I was not prepared for a lot of the reasoning behind both arguments, actually. They were very uninformed. They're just repeating sound bites often. And reflecting on it, I realized that they were missing a lot of historical context and contemporary demographic and socioeconomic content. And that I wasn't teaching it, even though I'm a US history teacher. I somehow just assumed they knew it. And well, I was teaching a more traditional curriculum. And of course, it contains very little historical history on the anti-Black racism. Typical US history class, there's not a lot beyond, after the civil rights movement, then they jump to Obama. So, and redlining is maybe mentioned very briefly, hardly anything on income inequality and political polarization. So the next year was also the 2016 elections. And I decided that my goal was that they would be able to participate in the national conversation that was occurring around that campaign, and that from an informed position this time, not just this is the right thing to say based on my ideology. So I basically taught all of the historical content for them to be able to understand the policy issues so that they could participate in the conversation and discussion. So I moved the 1950s to the present, or 1930s to the present unit, to the beginning of the year, because of course that's when they needed to know it in the fall. And I revamped that unit or units. I just took out the foreign relations part, and I taught that at the end of the year. And I just sort of reorganized things and added things. So we're looking at the historical through lines that explain racial inequality, racial tension, racism. It's a structural racism today. A second one was income inequality, which is also a huge a factor behind many of the policy issues. And finally, the political polarization. That was the shortest part. So I just taught a lot of the same history, but concentrating on those factors. And then at the end of the 6-week unit, I had I invited parents and family members, adults to a discussion day. I broke the kids up into groups of mixed groups of adults and students in several different classrooms, and I had several questions, but the discussion questions. But again, they weren't like right or wrong questions. They were like just wondering, right, exploring, analyzing, and the parents were floored at how well, even when they were presented with novel issues, they were able to connect and apply what they had learned. Well, that was because I intentionally did that, because I kept telling them throughout the unit. I was like, remember, the point is that not that you memorize these historical events, but remember, the point is that 15, 20 years, you hear about something new, a new issue or new policy, that you're able to identify the patterns, look below it and see what the tensions are between it, and be able to make an informed, and the historical context, and be able to make an informed decision on where you stand on it. So I emphasized that. I emphasized the patterns. Like, one of the things I did was, that before we started each unit, then I would present what I call value tensions. I made them up, but for example, individual rights versus the common good, civil liberties versus national security, and they were on a continuum. They're not right or wrong, but on a continuum. We did a lot of take a stand activities, for example, and I would, in the beginning of the unit, I would start out with very easy, very, something very obvious issues in their world around them, not national politics, where you have that tension. And then I would have them stand on a continuum, and for several different ones, until they were able to identify, see how in all these issues there's the same or similar tension underneath it. Then we would do the history, the unit, the historical, and again, every time a new historical event is, I help them see the patterns. And then at the end of the unit, we would go back to the present, but this time with a more meaty, controversial, issues that are actually in the news. And then the same thing, based on what you've learned in history and based on your understanding of those tensions, what can you tell me about, what insight does that give you into this issue? So they had tons of practice, each repetitive. And so at the end, they were able to do that. But
I
that's
love
my
that.
emphasis is on teaching historical and structural racism as opposed to interpersonal bias. I almost don't touch interpersonal bias. I think that's, first of all, that can be very ideologically laden. Especially if you don't have that historical context, then it becomes very emotional and contentious and very ideological. But also, I feel like I would be imposing a, a position on them. Like, this is the right thing. This is the correct answer. This is the right position. This is how you be not racist. And I do that with myself and my son, but I think it's inappropriate in the classroom. But I find that as long as you know that history and you have the evidence and you're basing your opinion on that evidence, then I found that the positions were, they could be very different ideologically, liberal and conservative, but you don't have anybody saying something, crazy or racist, right? So
Absolutely.
one of the ways I did that was, a key way that I did that is, in the beginning of the unit, I asked them the question, does structural racism exist? Like, just the start of the section on race. I said, this is, because I'm not going to tell them that structural racism exists. That's, but, first of all, as a Black woman, I'm definitely not going to say that to a predominantly white classroom. But anyhow, it's just not good teaching, right? That's basic teaching is, you don't. The students need to find out for themselves. So they looked at the data. So they did what I call a data inquiry. Instead of using historical inquiries are based on text, right? Primary sources text, sometimes images. This one was based on data. It's all data. But I did say this is an empirical inquiry. like you have in science, or but not an opinion, and not just in science, in social science, right? In economics, sociology, in human geography, it's an empirical issue that you're trying to figure out. So look at the data, and then at the end, I say, okay, what you're trying to figure out is, does structural racism exist? What did you find? And they're like, oh my God, it not only does it exist, but it is so much worse than we imagined. I knew structural racism existed because they told me. They told me. That is not good teaching, right? Um, but there, and also not only should you not be telling, the students should be looking at the data themselves, but also it was interesting that, once they saw the data, they saw it was so much worse than they imagined, because their imagination is, if you just say structural racism exists without that, them seeing the data themselves, they imagine it to be much smaller than it is. And then they could see also very specifically how, in some of the ways it plays out, right? So then I presented them with a framework for the entire unit. I said, we're going to distinguish between empirical issues and opinion/policy issues. So empirical issues are not up to debate. We don't debate whether the Holocaust occurred. We don't debate whether of what temperature water boils or freezes or whatever it is, right? So, and does structural racism exist? As we saw, it's an empirical issue. It's pretty straightforward to measure it, in different ways. It's broken down, how does structural racism affect, for instance, racial disparities in asthma, but there's tons, tons and tons of evidence, right, on that. So we don't, it's not appropriate to debate it. We assess the evidence on it, and you should definitely be given the opportunity to assess the evidence on empirical issues before you just make a decision, or based on what you think. But then we're going to separate that from policy questions, because that's opinion, and that's going to vary a lot, not just individually, not just your identity, but also your ideology, obviously, right? More government intervention, less government intervention. That is, we are not suggesting that one is better than the other. If you're against affirmative action, totally respect that. You know, that's an ideological opinion, but it's not the structural racism. That's not up for debate. And what that did was it greatly minimized. It pretty much cut out the vast majority of ways that classrooms are disrupted by conversations on race, and the vast majority of parent concerns, because most of the racism is going to enter the classroom when a student says, structural racism doesn't exist, not based on evidence, just because they haven't personally observed it in their 95% white community. They have never personally observed it. So structural racism doesn't exist, but they can see racial disparities. So, but the racial disparities are due to Black people just not working hard enough, or are due to being low income, right? And then that is not going to go over very well with the Black students or Latino students, or even people, other progressives, right? So that's going to be one source, and then the other source of the classroom disruption of these conversations going wrong is if a conservative student says, for example, I don't agree with affirmative action, which is a completely valid concern, but then they get called racist, or they get that pushback. So if you have that distinction between empirical versus policy, and you look at the evidence, yes, structural racism exists. It does impact. It does not determine racial disparities. Clearly, individual effort and merit obviously also play a role, and luck too, but it certainly impacts it. You have to consider the impact of that on racial disparities. But then once that's established, people can have different opinions on what to do about it. That is very different. And I would present that very just transparently to the students. And it would be interesting because, uh, first there was an outburst, and it was usually on progressive students. Progressive students would shout out, "What? You don't allow people to say that affirmative action is bad?" I'm like, "Yep." That is an opinion, right? And then, oh, it always went the exact same way. And then there'd be silence for like a minute, and you could almost see the cogs being, turning in their minds. And they're like, "Wait a second, wait, that works. That works. Yeah, that. Oh, yep, we're set." And it allowed for, it really reduced the tension, and it allowed for much more respectful conversations, respect for each other. That also, remember, combined with those value tensions, right? Because uh, I had I was at the same time simultaneously, teaching them that, those other people aren't stupid. It's not a I'm right, they're wrong, I got it right, they're stupid, but rather that they're valuing a different, that they're on the other, that they're valuing a different value in that value tension. And all of us agree that both of those values are important. Everybody agrees that individual rights and the common good are good things, and based on the context, they're also foundational, part of our Constitution. They're foundational values. Same thing, civil liberties, national security, but we disagree on where on that continuum, what balance we're on. So that, combined with the empirical versus policy framework, plus some other work I did with, for example, I do deliberations instead of debates. Also, it's not I'm right, I'm wrong, but we have to listen to each other, respect each other's, and come to um, you know, uh, a final solution that benefits the common good. But again, only policy issues, no, only policy issues, right? Not empirical issues, right? And so, and I also emphasize, that the goal was also the reason why I wanted them to be able to understand and take informed positions on policy was so that they could work together across difference, racial difference, ideological difference, whatever, work together, um, and deliberate together to find, solutions that benefit the common good, that all of us are the benefit the country, because that was also a concern of mine, that we're so politically polarized. Anyway, I talked a lot. So
No, this is beautiful. I feel like this was like the majority of like what everyone needed to hear. So I'm so glad you went through all of it. I just wanted to highlight a few things that stuck out to me of just like this idea of how it looks in practice. Cause you took us kind of from you took us through the framework and the vision, but you took us through it through the lens of an actual unit, or how you would lay this out for students. And so some things I'm just thinking, if a listener is thinking, okay, how do I coach a history teacher to kind of do some of these things? I love the idea of kind of that. And I've talked about it on the podcast here before, and you were the one who introduced me to this theory, or this concept of kind of the empirical or the policy, right? I think McAvoy and Hess, right, like talk about these things. And so that is fascinating, right? So we don't debate the empirical, we do debate the policy. We can have a continuum. I love that idea. It's not either or, you can be on a continuum.
only on policy issues. Oh,
Right. Yes. Great point. And then also that it benefits the common good. I think that grounding is like really central to the conversation. And that's how you get through those two challenges that you raised, right? If a teacher's just kind of going in and saying, we're going to have these debates about policy issues, but the grounding isn't in that your answer has to benefit the common good, then you probably could get a lot of like racism and things coming out. But that grounding just makes it so that we eliminate, like you were saying, a lot of those concerns we may have. And honestly, concerns that teachers, often those concerns are so daunting for teachers that they don't even start the conversations because they're afraid of what might happen and they feel ill-equipped. And I think these are logistical things that you can do in a classroom to have a generative conversation that respects the dignity and honors the dignity of everyone and still enables for disagreement and like an authentic deliberation. So I just want to say thank you, because that is amazing.
yeah, even I came to U.S. history after teaching civics and government for several years. So I had that background. So civic discourse um, and was important to me.
That
So
makes sense to me
I
now.
and I already had a lot of civic activities, like for instance the deliberation. The take a stand. I had already done the value tensions. I transferred them over. I invented that. I came up with that when I was teaching U.S. government and civics. So I sort of adapted it to the history setting.
I love the value tension. So honestly, I just was working with the U.S. history team who was developing some new units, and my favorite one that they developed was, they didn't frame it in that exact way, like a value tension, but it basically was like, is it more important to have this value or this value? And that was like the key question. And I just envision a world where like U.S. history units are taught where like each unit is a value tension, and then we just go back in history to explore like the both sides of those tensions, and then we use it to, like you were saying, bring it to the modern deliberation, like what's going on now. Because I love your goal of like, how do we get students today to understand what's going on today using kind of history and that grounding to really be able to participate in the national discourse. Like I love that. I would love to see that everywhere.
Thank you. The value tensions have several goals or benefits, and one is, like you said, the respect on of other positions, ideological positions, but also it also encourages them to move a little bit towards off the extremes. I don't care where they are. They don't. I don't. It's not like I want them all to be exactly in the middle, but the extremes are usually not very healthy, right? So and stop thinking it as a binary, but it usually leads them to have a position that's at least slightly, off of the extremes on the continuum, because that's what a debate does. A debate encourages you, almost forces you to be, 100% this or 100% this, the whole package, right? But that allows them to think more critically. It's also encourages more critical thinking, right? Because you're able to weigh it, and you can say, well, this, but that, maybe actually this part can be further on and this part can be down. You break down the components and really weigh the advantages and disadvantages, which helps you, like I said, it helps your critical thinking skills, and also it really helps you have a more informed position rather than just, the talking points. And then the other advantage of the value tension is that's what allowed them to draw the historical through lines, or not all by itself, but it really helped them to draw the historical through lines, and also, again, to be able to understand the present day issues, because they had two resources, or one was that historical context, right? For example, terms that are used in politics, right? They're historically laden. They have they say historical connotation. They have, lots of the terms we use, law and order, and on and on and on, right? They have deep historical connotations that kids don't know, right? So they have that historical context and historical connotation, and then they have that value tension, and those two things will allow them to make an informed decision. And I also, yet another thing is, everything else that I've said so far was explicit, very explicit, and very that I taught the kids. One thing I did not explicitly share with the kids is that I indirectly I modeled. Well, first of all, I modeled that we're learning, right? We're growing. We're constantly making mistakes, and that's okay. So I would tell them, for example, I'm wearing my teacher hat, right? So, I mean, you can't say something completely obnoxious, but this is your chance to ask all those questions that you were scared to ask, because this is a learning space, and then once you, so that you don't make those mistakes, or you feel more confident when you go out and have these conversations elsewhere. But also, I modeled in the very beginning when we started that. I don't talk about bias very much. I feel that it's more important as a U.S. history teacher to teach that historical context and about structural racism, teaching about bias and interpersonal racism, first of all, it's hard to do without being uh, teaching progressive values, right? Which is not inappropriate in the classroom. We should be non-ideological, and it's very much telling kids, how you should, the what you should. If you don't believe this, then you are racist, and this is the right position. I don't know. It's hard to, yeah, and also that U.S. history, right? That's the historical context is that history and that the contemporary structural racism, that's my job, right? And also, they can learn. It's pretty easy to learn about bias outside the classroom. They have 100 chances to learn about interpersonal racism outside that classroom, but they will have very few chances to learn that history and about structural racism outside the classroom. And finally, that historical and structural racism will set them up to learning about bias because from what I've seen, a lot of ways that these conversations and discussions on bias go wrong is like how my students, when they discussed affirmative action, right? Because they're not aware that they're not those positions on bias or interpersonal racism are not informed by it. So I see my role as setting them up. But anyhow, so that but so I would model that that the one of the few times I talked about bias is at the very beginning to set the tone in the classroom. So the one thing this is you can't say it in something obnoxious, but you can ask questions that you would be afraid to ask somewhere else. And then the the second thing is I would model. Look, I'm 50-year-old African American woman, and I step in it all the time. I mess up, right? Um, with other, I say things that are offensive to other people. And I gave an example. Actually, I gave an actual example that involved another staff member. Or maybe I didn't name them. I forget. But and I say I'm continuing learning. I mess up. I fall down. I apologize. I inform myself, so I won't do that. At least particular thing again. I said that's part of it, just a natural part of living in a diverse uh, country, and it has tons of benefits. I love living in such a diverse community, but my responsibility as a resident, a citizen, is that I need to educate myself on it, and I'm going to make mistakes along the way. You know, I mean, it's not like you say, check, I don't have any more biases. I was like, it's like, I don't say check, I learned how to be a good mother, right? Or, you don't say check, I learned how to be a good Christian, Jew, or Muslim, right? It's a con, or check, I am the perfect partner, spouse, right? It's a constant process, and you're going to mess up. You are going to inadvertently offend your spouse or your child, right? What do? You just apologize, inform yourself, keep on going. And so I think that helped a lot. And then the final thing is that I was, again, I didn't say it, but I made comments along the way that helped them see themselves as a we. I fostered a we identity. I call it equity conscious we identity. I told them, it's like the six blind men who touched the elephant in different parts. We're living on different parts of the elephant. We're not just touching different parts of the elephant. We live on different parts of the elephant. So our Americas look very different. We each see an experience of very different America. So we got to talk, but so just like the six blind men, we got to talk to each other so that we can move the elephant forward together, because we're, even though we're on different parts of the elephant, we're also on the same elephant, and it benefits us all to move it forward. So you got to figure out how to look at empirical evidence and how to talk about policy issues and listen to each other so that you can figure out solutions that benefit the common good, which is the whole elephant, to move it forward. So we were constant. I would say, you guys have to learn these skills. You have to learn the skills of looking for evidence. I also taught them how to read data graphs. Of course, they learned that in math class, but it's different for social science issues. We looked at learning how to data, learning You learn how to go to evidence, and then learn how to deliberate, learn how civic discourse, you're learning all these things so that when you go out in the world, you can help. I told them, us adults messed up, right? We've created this world with racism and uh, structural poverty, structural racism, extreme political polarization. We can't even pass any laws because Congress is so divided. We adults messed that up. But I'm I'm counting on you. You guys have the opportunity to use these skills to move the elephant forward, to vote on policies that will improve the country and bring us back together, that will reduce structural racism, reduce structural poverty, and and pass laws that improve the common good. Um, so you notice what I was doing there is, first of all, I'm fostering that we identity with many differences, but and you can work together, right? But the second thing also is I'm taking away the shame and blame, right? You are not, no, none of you as young people are responsible for what was in the past. But you are collectively responsible for improving the future. You see that difference? And then I would say, 30 years from now, when I'm in that old people home, don't let me find out that you guys dropped the ball. We are counting on you to work together and move things forward and fix a little bit of what we messed up. So I didn't tell them what was behind that. That was the only thing I didn't tell them what was behind that. But I was fostering that those feelings, or disposition, I should say.
That is amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think as we move to close, I think people have been listening, have probably been like, yes, I want to do all of these things. And I'm wondering if there's one thing we can share as a place to start for either a teacher or someone who's kind of coaching teachers, history teachers, to kind of do this better. What's kind of step one? What's kind of the thing that gets the momentum going if you had to pick one? Hi, it's Lindsay, just popping in here quickly to tell you about today's episode freebie. Ayo talks about in this episode her lesson plan, where she uses the metaphor of the blind man and the elephant to teach about important structural racism concepts. That lesson is going to be available to you for free. Thank you, Aya. And that will be located on our blog post for this episode. That's at lindsay.lyons.com/blog/132. Back to the episode.
That's kind of hard because they definitely worked in. I would not do one of those alone. So I guess you could divide it into, let's see, two parts, right? In basic, it's that same thing, the empirical. So for the empirical, teaching that history, teaching that structural racism. So unfortunately, I had to invent that. Basically, I had to teach myself a lot of it too, and then I had to create resources and figure out how to teach it to kids, because teaching about historical and structural racism, is hard. I do have a, a short article in Psychology Today that summarizes the because I train now. I now train teachers how to do this, but I would tell them you cannot do them separate. So you have to, on one hand, teach that historical and structural racism with tons of data, not just primary sources, but data, etc. On one hand, and I came up from bad experiences. Well, what I did is, after every time I would try something new, or after the unit, I was constantly sending out Google Monkey forms, anonymous, but they had to specify their race and their ideology. And I would pour through those and then say, oh, I need to adjust it, and I would adjust it for the next year. Or sometimes if I could see it did not go well in the classroom, I would come back the next day and say, I'm sorry, I apologize. That did not go well. I'm going to restart that. So but anyhow, yeah. So that's one set of skills and resources to teach about structural racism, and they don't really exist. And then the other part is the more civic part. So that includes the value tensions, and that basically I call it it's perspectives consciousness, or being able to take perspectives taking, they call it. And I use the blind man and the elephant framework. I would simulate it with the students. Students would simulate the blind man and the elephant. I have that lesson is free on my website, by the way. Um, so
Awesome.
on the very first day of school, I would blindfold, 3 volunteers, and I brought out this old sculpture of a bear that I found in the art room storage. Um, and then I put a different part into each of their hands. I'd say, describe the shape, not the texture of the field, but the shape. Of course, they disagreed. And then I would share the parable, a metaphor to them, and they got it right. Everyone has different perspectives on the issue. And I said, okay, I'm going to take it one step forward, and I gave them maps of the racial maps of Washington, D.C., where I was, and you could see the stark segregation of both. I gave them 3 maps: racial, political ideology, or who voted for in the last election, and also income. And I said, okay, how does that connect? And they were working in pairs, and usually it take them a while, but eventually each year, one of the kids would say, oh my God, we're not just touching different parts of the elephant, we're actually living on different parts of the elephant. We're experiencing different Americas. And I said, yes. So the experiencing different Americas, that's the empirical issues, right? In large part, right? Because you have students say who look at a graph of national graph and say, no, that's not true. Because yeah, you see that map right there. You see that you see that neighborhood right there. That's 99% white, and high income. Yeah, you live in that bubble. You don't see the rest of the world. This is national averages, right? So that living on different parts of the elephant is more like that empirical, and then the touching is more like the policy. The different opinions based on your identity and stuff. And I put that I blew up that poster and have it on the wall all year long, and we would refer to it, and the kids would refer to it, like if they're having a discussion, not even about race, about the year, right? They're having a discussion about whatever, and one of the kids gets entrenched in their position, the other kid would point to the wall and say, "Remember the elephant." It got to where the English teachers came to me and were like, "So what is this elephant that the kids are talking about in English in my class?" So they
That's so
started,
great.
but so yeah, those 2 parts, they have to be, you have to do them in tandem. Um,
That makes
Absolutely.
so much sense.
Yeah, because if you just like present the structural racism without, first of all, giving them that freedom to have different opinions on political issues, you can see how that doesn't go well. And also without training them to work together, to respect each other's differences on different parts of the all that, they work together. And then also vice versa. I would not do any of the civics part unless they had the historical and economic evidence too. So they work together. But I do have um, so that's what I do now. I train teachers how to do that, and I also I developed. I have like huge, um, huge data bases of not databases. I have these huge PowerPoint of just slides of different data points, different historical resources, primary sources, um, and that's part of the package. If I train teachers, um, they get that just treasure trove of tons and tons of yeah, slides with data graphs with the results of different research, primary sources, etc. Um, and then they can pick and choose, of course, based on their curriculum, based on their interests, based on whatever it makes it easier for them to feed it into their own curriculum. They can take to enhance. So
Yeah. And I was going to say, you're leading me into my final question of just like where people can learn more about you. And of course, we'll link to all these things, the Psychology Today article, that lesson you were saying, we'll link to your site and the lesson on perspectives consciousness. Where can people who are, a lot of people who listen to this are leaders, and if they're interested in bringing you to their school for training, like how do they get in touch with you, and where would you want them to go to connect?
Yep. My consultancy is named Uprooting Inequity. So that's intentional. It's the uprooting is reflective of my focus on getting to root causes, right? So when they're looking at policy issues, when you're looking, and also on the institutional level, right? So if you're trying to address, for example, inequity on the institutional level as school administrators, let's drill down to the root causes. And some of them may be historical, some of them may be behavioral science. I'm a huge nerd. I eat peer-reviewed journal articles for breakfast. So I'm always the historical roots, economic roots, behavioral science, and as in addition to evidence-based strategies. So I'm always like, let's get to, so that's essentially the same thing with the policy issues, right? I'm telling the kids, don't vote on it or take a position because this is the right way, but let's get to the root behind the policy issue, which is historical and structural racism or whatever the equivalent is. So that's why I'm uprooting inequity instead of addressing on the top. And I have a website, uprootinginequity.com.
Perfect. I thank you so much for being a guest on this show today. It has been a pleasure learning from you.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan, from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.